Okay, so welcome back again, everybody. This time we're still in the American Revolution, but we're going to talk about more dealing with the battles during the war and the events during the war that are really going to be significant turning points. So the war technically begins in April of 1775. Initially, the war doesn't go very well for the Americans. Since we're not a military history class, we're not going to go into a lot of detail about individual battles and campaigns and overall strategies and things like that. But we will touch on a couple of things that are going to be really, really important, because they're going to be things that will be turning points or kind of watershed moments in the course of the war. And so here's a map that outlines some of the major campaigns, some of the major battles, troop movements, and so on. And as I said in the last recording, the war happens practically everywhere in the colonies. It even moves up into Canada. There are some efforts made by the Americans to try to capture Canada / bring the Canadians in on the side of the American cause. Those are spectacular failures and cost a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of manpower that the colonies can't really afford to lose. But you can see, right, there's stuff going on in New England, stuff going on in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, down into Virginia, the Carolinas, right, all over the place. And so it is a widespread kind of a conflict, and it involves a lot of different parts of the American colonies, or once independence is declared, the American states. One of the most important battles of the whole war is Saratoga. And Saratoga ultimately is a couple of different sort of battles, but the culminating one is October 7th, 1777. The idea of the British in this battle is to divide the colonies in half. Well, to split them, right? Maybe not technically in half. There is a British general who is in Canada at the time. His name's John Burgoyne. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne was his nickname. And Burgoyne decides that he is going to move south along the Hudson River Valley in New York State, and he's going to hopefully meet up with his comrade, William Howe, who is, in theory, going to move out of the Philadelphia area and march north up the Hudson River Valley to meet up with Burgoyne, and they will then basically have separated New England, which is east of the Hudson River, and the rest of the Americans west of the Hudson River. And they can then sort of divide and conquer. So today, if you were to drive across New York State, you can cross the Hudson River lots and lots and lots of places, right? Lots of bridges or ferries or whatever, all over the place. In 1777, there are literally no bridges that can cross the Hudson River, right? Engineering isn't capable of developing a bridge that can do that. So you would have to get a ferry, which is literally going to be a small raft that will be able to carry, a dozen people, 24 people at most. So it's very, very difficult to cross the Hudson River. And so if you can control the Hudson River, you can essentially use it as a natural barrier to separate one part of the colonies from another. And that's the idea here. So the Americans really can't let this happen. So the American army that meets Burgoyne, because Howe never actually leaves Philadelphia, the American army that meets Burgoyne's army is led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold's name is probably recognizable to people, Probably not because of this particular battle, probably because of his role later in the war as arguably the most famous traitor in American history. In this case, Arnold, though, is distinguishing himself as one of the leading generals in the Continental Army. And he is. He is mostly responsible for America's victory, although Gates takes a lot of the credit. Burgoyne has to surrender. He surrenders virtually his entire army of more than 6,000 soldiers. A huge, huge blow to the British, a huge victory for the Americans, one of the few major American victories, boosts morale at a time when that was desperately needed. Certainly important from the military standpoint, right? You have eliminated, at least for now, eliminated this British threat to divide the colonies at the Hudson River. And so you have achieved a number of different things in the immediate sort of perspective. Midterm and long-term, though, the Battle of Saratoga is more important for the diplomatic impact that it has, because Saratoga is the battle that convinces France that the American cause is achievable. So before 1777, Franklin and other American diplomats were in France pleading with the French to join the American cause, right? They managed to get the French to contribute pretty significant amounts of money, but they can't convince the French to contribute military assistance or diplomatic recognition, and those are essential. Well, with Saratoga, Franklin and his colleagues can go to the French government and say, look, guys, see, I told you that the Americans were going to be able to pull this out. Here is a clear and decisive victory, you know, force on force against a major British army, and it is a no questions about it American success. And so France says, okay, I can see that this has sort of made the difference, and I'm willing to go ahead and support the American cause now. It takes a while before French material assistance and manpower assistance and logistical assistance and officers start to arrive in the colonies, but that is going to be a completely essential contribution to the American victory overall in the war. But the revolution is now becoming a global event, right? When Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, when it is approved in July of 1776, there is a large part of the document that is a list of the different grievances, the different complaints that the Americans have with the British. And this is because Jefferson recognizes that he has to explain the American Revolution to the rest of the world, right? This is literally the first time in all of human history that something like this has happened. And so there is no precedent, there is no example that the world can look at to say, oh, well, I guess the Americans here are doing what such and such did back in whatever year. This is the first time that this kind of thing has ever happened. And so Jefferson has to explain to other parts of the world and to the British what the revolution is all about. So the most famous part of the Declaration of Independence is the opening that talks about the natural rights of human beings, that talks about the concept of social contract, which we will get into in the next recording. But the biggest part of the document as a whole is that list of grievances. And that was really the thing that most delegates and Jefferson himself put the most time into, because they wanted to make it clear that this was a thoughtful decision and that this was justified because of legitimate, quote-unquote, legitimate complaints or concerns that the Americans had. So the revolution is becoming a global kind of a thing, an international issue. France signs an alliance after the Battle of Saratoga. France agrees to a military alliance in 1778. There are diplomatic efforts between the Americans and other European powers that fit into this whole thing. But the global issue of all of this also fits into British approaches to the war. The American colonies are one part of the British Empire. They are not the only thing that Britain has to worry about. Britain has its own internal issues. Britain has possessions in the Caribbean. They have an increasing presence in parts of Africa. They have a presence in Southern and Southeast Asia. They have things going on in Europe. The American circumstance and the American Revolution is just a part of what Britain needs to think about. And by 1778, 1779, Britain is beginning to think, you know what, this is taking us longer than it should. We're expending a lot of money. We're losing a lot of soldiers. We're losing a lot of focus from other things that we need to sort of deal with at the same time. And so they start to change their overall strategy with regard to the revolution. They decide, well, what we're going to do is we're going to look more towards the southern states, the southern colonies, and take advantage of a somewhat larger loyalist population down there in the hopes that we can sort of bring them on board, either in terms of actually fighting on behalf of the British Army, or at the very least, these people can pass along information and military intelligence, or they can undermine or disrupt the American cause. Politically speaking, the British decide, well, what if we were to restore some governments in southern states that are loyal to the British Crown? Because, as I said, the Continental Congress requires, the only way that it can get money is to ask states to provide it. So if that state government ends up changing sides and aligning themselves with the British, that state will no longer be contributing manpower or money to the Patriot cause. So the leader that now is overall in charge of the British effort is a man named Sir Henry Clinton. And Clinton begins the process of sort of throwing some money around to try to appeal to fence-sitters or to try to bring over some borderline loyalists. In the case of Benedict Arnold, this money convinces him that he is not being respected or not being recognized or treated fairly by the Continental Army and by the Continental Congress, which in some ways he's not. And so people like Benedict Arnold, he's certainly the most infamous of this whole process, decide to trade their loyalty to the cause in exchange for money. And Arnold ends up being a general in the British service. He will fight a number of battles against the Americans in 1780 and 1781. And so this strategy does have some success, right? They do manage to restore loyalist governments in Georgia and in South Carolina. Ultimately, though, the Southern strategy doesn't really bear fruit in the way that the British were hoping. The person who's in charge of the Southern Army, then, is a man named Charles Cornwallis, General Lord Charles Cornwallis. And he's the one that is responsible for operating the part of the British Army that is waging these wars or these battles in the southern states. So Clinton is in overall command of the British effort in the colonies. Cornwallis is going to operate in those southern states. Clinton will stay in New York. So Cornwallis is moving through the Carolinas. He is gradually sort of pushing northward towards Virginia. Virginia is the real cherry in all of this. If the British can manage to tip Virginia out of the American cause, out of the Patriot cause, that would be a huge, huge blow to the likelihood of American success, even with French involvement. But Cornwallis is constantly harassed and bothered by an American army under a guy named Nathaniel Greene. And Nathaniel Greene realizes that he can't really attack Cornwallis face to face, right, head on. So what he needs to do is just badger Cornwallis, right? Attack his supply lines, kind of attack his flanks, attack his rear every so often, to try to kind of whittle away Cornwallis's force without risking a direct face-to-face battle. And this is really starting to get on Cornwallis's nerves. And he decides, if I can only confront Greene in a major battle, I can defeat him. And Greene is smart and savvy enough to know not to get into that position. Cornwallis says, well, the way that you force an enemy into a direct face-to-face battle is you establish a fortified position. And so that's what he does. He fortifies a town along the Virginia coast known as Yorktown. And Yorktown will end up leading to basically the decisive battle of the American Revolution. Cornwallis is hoping, I'm going to build up my fortification at Yorktown. It's right on the water. Worst case scenario, I can get resupplied or I can get evacuated by the British Navy. Best case scenario, I'm going to draw Nathaniel Greene into direct combat and wipe him out. And so then I can move basically sort of unencumbered or unchallenged up into the center of Virginia. Well, so he's sitting at Yorktown for a couple weeks, and General Washington, who has been outside of New York, itching to attack New York, where the British are headquartered, Washington eventually lets himself get convinced by the commander of the French forces in America, the Comte de Rochambeau, to move out of New York and march all the way down to Virginia as secretly as possible to encircle Cornwallis's position at Yorktown. And so he does, right? Washington leads an army of several thousand, I think between 8,000 and 12,000, if I remember right, along with a lot of French engineers, right? Army engineers, combat engineers. And they reach the position and begin to build their own trenches to lay siege to Yorktown, right? To basically squeeze Yorktown, Cornwallis's position there, to squeeze it into submission. Well, none of this would have mattered if the British had maintained control of the oceans, right? The British Navy, most powerful navy in the world. The one time that the British Navy loses that control just happens to be in the weeks leading up to the Battle of Yorktown. And so this means that the British cannot get resupplied, they can't get rescued, they can't get reinforced, because the British Navy doesn't have access to the Yorktown location. Well, this makes Cornwallis's position at Yorktown completely indefensible, right? He cannot maintain that position because he doesn't have any resources left. So he surrenders, October 19th, 1781. That is the end of actual combat, major combat. There are skirmishes that take place here and there. But it's pretty clear at that moment that England has decided whatever happens to Cornwallis, that will be the deciding factor of the revolution. So peace negotiations then begin in Europe. Some prominent Americans, Adams, Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, are responsible for negotiating not just between the Americans and the British, but they have to include the French, they have to include the Spanish. It's a much more elaborate, involved kind of situation, and they do a really good job of playing the game, right? In the end, Britain actually recognizes American independence September 3rd, 1783. This is the Treaty of Paris, right? This is a different Treaty of Paris than the Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War, okay? So the Treaty of Paris in September of 1783 is going to result in not only America's actual independence, which is a significant achievement, and we have to keep in mind that just because the Americans declare independence in July of 1776, that doesn't make it so, right? That's when we celebrate, but that's only because we ended up winning the war. It would be the same as if you woke up one morning and just decided, I'm a college graduate, and you just write a piece of paper that says, hey everybody, I just graduated college. That doesn't make any difference, right? The people that actually make that decision are the trustees and the administration of the university itself. Just like in this case, the people that made the decision were the British, who said, yes, you officially are no longer part of our empire. The other thing that the Americans get out of all of this is a vast amount of land, much, much more than anybody anticipated. In 1783, the American colonies technically really only stretched to the Appalachian Mountains. Britain controlled everything between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, but that wasn't really, it was Indian territory, right? It was land that was meant to be separated and designated for Native Americans, and was not really absorbed into the official operation of the British Empire. So the American colonies really existed between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean. Well, with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the Americans get all of that land, all the way to the Mississippi. This is going to be a significant thing to remember, because as we get into aspects of American expansion in other ways, including the Louisiana Purchase and the sectional conflict and things like that, that will be an important thing to sort of recognize as part of that whole process as well. Excuse me. So that is the end of the war. What we're going to do in our next recording then is actually talk about some of the ideas that led to not only the war, but also some of the sort of explanations for or theories about independence. It's kind of abstract, but the American Revolution, more than most revolutions, was really grounded on theory in a lot of ways. And since I personally am trained as an intellectual historian, this is the kind of stuff that really gets me excited and that I really like to talk about. So unfortunately for you guys, that means that you're going to have to sit through listening to all of that too. And so that's going to be our next topic when we wrap up the American Revolution stuff. Let me know if you've got questions and I'll be happy to answer them. Keep looking over the full PowerPoints that are on Blackboard as well. And so I will see everybody shortly.